Great to be with you here in beautiful Prague. So today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about impact markets. A lot of people are very excited about paying people to do great stuff that has a positive impact beyond simply producing a commodity. So first I want to talk a little bit about the scope of the problem that we at KlimaDAO are focused on. In particular, the climate crisis. In my view, it's the most urgent problem facing our generation, and I intend to spend the next decade plus working on it. This graph is really just an overview of the state of play in the emissions trajectory for the planet. It's from an old McKinsey report. It's a little outdated, but it'll give you a general sense of the scope of the problem. In particular, this chart is showing the net carbon dioxide emissions in gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And on the left side of the chart, you basically see status quo. Our current emissions are around 40 gigatons a year. And the projections from the IPCC, the UN's sort of climate change focused research group, are that we need to dramatically reduce emissions and also aggressively implement what are called negative emissions. So those are the red bars that you see on the bottom of the chart. And the point here is that even in a perfect world where we implement all of the green technology, we reduce energy usage, we all stop flying, switch to bikes and trains instead of cars, there is a certain amount of residual emissions that we expect to continue on an ongoing basis because there are certain things that are very difficult to decarbonize. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but the point is that there is some activities that will generate carbon emissions, whether it's like cow farts if we want to continue having milk and meat, or emissions from the breakdown of compost in our compost piles. There's some amount of residual emissions, and to counter those in the steady state, we need to have negative emissions, and in fact, pretty large-scale negative emissions on the order of tens of gigatons per year. So how do we do this? And the answer that we have currently in the market is the solution called carbon credits. They're somewhat controversial, and I hope that I can explain the underlying technology here, and we can address maybe some of the concerns during the questions. But there's basically two different types of carbon credit. The premise here is that you're either going to avoid emissions going up into the atmosphere in the first place, or you're going to remove emissions that have already gone up. And there's a few different methodologies associated with each type. In the removal space, you've probably all heard about tree planting, direct air capture. These are techniques that will take carbon dioxide that's already up there in the atmosphere, draw it down, and store it in some medium, whether that's the body of a tree or underground in like a cavern full of canisters full of carbon dioxide. On the other hand, you have reduction or avoidance-based credits, and the idea here is you're going to prevent the carbon from going up there in the first place. And both of these have a role to play. For instance, on the previous slide, that red bar, that only comes from removals, right? The avoidances will lower the top blue bars. They won't remove carbon dioxide that's already up there, and so you kind of need both at a certain level. In particular, I want to highlight the fact that right now, avoidances are the whole market. There are very few carbon credits out there that are removal based compared to the scale of what's available for avoidance. As an example, it's much easier to go and protect existing forests from being cut down than it is to go plant trees, make sure they're healthy, grow up strong, and actually sequester a lot of carbon. It takes time, and also it's very expensive. Whereas if you can get some existing forest in, say, the Amazon rainforest that is under the threat of deforestation, it's going to be cut down for logging or other purposes to clear land for agriculture, it's much easier to just convince people not to cut that down and then monitor it to make sure the trees actually don't get cut down. So they have a role to play. But the key is there's only so much avoidance you can do. And in particular, things like protecting forests, there's only so many forests out there to protect, there's only so many solar panels to install, and so avoidances will naturally cap out. Removals, on the other hand, don't have a theoretical limit. It's sort of like, what's the total amount of carbon dioxide that's been emitted into the atmosphere total? And like, you could draw all of that down in theory. I don't think we want to do that because then like the plants wouldn't have anything to photosynthesize with, but the theoretical upper bound is very high compared to the theoretical upper bound for avoidance credits. So they both have a role to play, and the expectation is that avoidance will cap out and go down, while removals will need to scale up to address that bottom red bar from the previous slide. Okay, so now I want to pivot and start talking more about the market structure of carbon credits and more generally try to learn some lessons from how carbon credits are structured that we can apply to other impact markets. People are very excited about a lot of different stuff: water credits, plastic credits, biodiversity credits, women's education credits. I mean, the list goes on. Obviously, we're here at a hackathon in ETH Prague, and there's a lot of excitement about paying people to develop open source software as a public good, and giving people certificates that prove they supported open source software. So in a simple two-sided market, we were all eating food earlier. If you buy, an apple or some corn or grain at a store, there's a supply chain that gets that product to you, the end user, and it starts with the farmer, the producer who's going to go plant things in the ground and is going to harvest them and produce that commodity. That will then flow through to the wholesalers who will distribute that out to individual grocery stores, and the grocery stores then sell it on to you, the end user. And most of the value here ends up getting captured by the farmer. The margins for the wholesalers and the grocery stores they're pretty thin. If you know anyone who runs a grocery store, they make very thin margins on most products. And so vast majority of the value is being accrued back to the farmers, which is important because if we want to have food to eat and feed our growing population, we need more farmers to go out and start farming and produce these commodities. But this is a traditional market. It's relatively simple because basically the goods flow in one direction, the money flows in the other direction, and there's pretty fierce competition at all levels of this market. And so prices are reasonable and margins are relatively thin. There's been talk about this notion of a hypercert as an implementation, a simple specification for what an impact market or an impact certificate might look like. This is not my idea. This is coming from a group out of Protocol Labs. If you want to learn more, check out hypercerts.org. And the basic model is that you have a three-sided market and then a sort of registry where you can see the assets that are being created. Because unlike a commodity like an apple, there's no physical thing to reference against, right? Like there's no physical asset. And so you need a way to represent that physical asset, or that impact asset in a digital form. And hypercerts are like the representative, the asset that we're talking about. So on the top right, just like we had the farmers as the ultimate source of the value, the implementers, the people going out and educating women, or writing open source software, or planting trees to sequester carbon, those are the implementers. And they're doing the hard work. In my view, most of the value should accrue to the implementer. But there are other parties involved. In addition to the implementer, you obviously have the end buyer who's like putting the money in, saying, I want to see more open source software, I want to see more trees planted, and they provide funding, usually through an indirect market where they buy an asset, to the project developer, the implementer. And then finally, you have the evaluator. And the evaluator plays a critical role in this market that doesn't really exist or isn't relevant for a traditional market like Apple's. In particular, you need to make sure that the project developer actually did what they said they were going to do, right? And that they didn't fake it, or they didn't just cut down the trees when they said they weren't going to cut them down. So you need to check. And the evaluator's role is to check that the product created by the project developer, the implementer, actually is what it says on the tin. Now, in particular, this hypercert registry piece is going to be really important because they're going to set a standard for what a good hypercert looks like. What is the data format? What does the evaluator need to check for a given type of hypercert? And this could be fairly open. Like for open source software, I don't think we need super strict standards about this because it's a fairly widespread practice. And the sort of effect of having a poor specification on something like open source software is relatively low, because the software gets created and we can all see what it is. Whereas when you have something like a carbon credit, it's important that there's some level of standardization around that asset so that the buyer kind of knows what to expect when they buy something like a tree planting carbon credit. So now I want to compare this setup with carbon credits. And this diagram didn't change that much, but some of the labels changed. In particular, the implementer is usually called the project developer in this context. The buyer's the same. The evaluators are usually called validation and verification bodies. Usually they're like consulting firms. And finally, we have the registries. You've probably heard some of these names, Vera, Gold Standard, there's a bunch of them, but those are the main leaders. And this is very simplified. The market is actually a lot more complex than this, but it fits well into the hypercert framework, and hopefully will give you a grounding to understand what's really going on here. Okay. This is what the market actually looks like. This is a map from Puro Earth earlier this year, and let's just say it's complicated. And it's not getting simpler, it's getting more complex. So there's a need to learn some lessons from this very complex market if we're going to start building new impact markets for things like plastics and biodiversity. Otherwise, we're going to end up with this again, and it's going to be very difficult for buyers and participants to understand and navigate this market, these new markets. Okay, so I want to highlight an aspect in the title of my talk around bootstrapping. What does it mean to create a new market where there isn't one already? There's a couple different strategies you can pursue for bootstrapping a market, depending on what type of market you're bootstrapping. In particular, the capital requirements are going to dictate what type of funding mechanism will work well for incentivizing people to start doing this activity. In particular, if there's a high startup capital requirement, it's going to be very difficult for people to just go out and do it on their own. They're going to need some source of funding ahead of time to fund them going and planting trees or installing solar panels to pay for the capital upfront. Whereas if the capital requirements are relatively low, like say building open source software, you can do that on your laptop from anywhere in the world. All you need is an internet connection. Something like retroactive funding, which is what Optimism is using to try to incentivize open source software in the Ethereum ecosystem, can work really well. And there's, of course, more traditional ways like debt and venture capital and crowdfunding that can supplement private goods. But for public goods, many of those don't make sense because people don't want to put money into something that isn't going to bring a direct benefit back to them. And so forward funding, in my view, plays a really critical role in these high capital intensity impact markets. I also want to highlight a trade-off that's inherent to these impact assets, which is the difference between liquidity and fungibility. We all probably have heard of non-fungible tokens. Sort of all the way on the left-hand side of this spectrum, you have fine art, real estate, PFPs fall a little closer to the right, a little closer to the middle. And the idea here is, what is the unique class? Like, how many comparable assets are there in this class? And the fewer there are, like for fine art, for instance, there's no liquidity for fine art, right? You're not like going to create a liquid market with bids and asks for fine art. It's more like it comes up for auction. And if someone wants to buy at that price, they buy at that price. They might even bid up the price. Whereas all the way on the other side, you have things like the dollar or corn, which are highly liquid, have global markets, trade billions of dollars every day. In the case of the dollar, it's trillions of dollars of movement. And the key thing is that they unlock scale. You can have a global market. You can have millions of participants all over the world when you have liquidity. And carbon credits fall kind of in the middle. A given project might produce a few 100,000, a few million credits, and those will be directly comparable. However, not all carbon credits will be comparable to each other. For instance, if I planted trees, that's a very different kind of activity than if I protected an existing forest. Or if I installed solar panels, that's a very different activity than direct air capture, where I suck the carbon dioxide out of the air. And so they demand different prices, and therefore they are not fungible. So carbon credits need to strike a balance between this liquidity and fungibility trade-off to both model the unique characteristics of the project, as well as unlocking liquidity and scale, which are going to matter if this whole thing makes a difference for the climate crisis, because the scale right now is about 1 billion tons of carbon credits ever issued. The scale of the problem is around 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide emitted since the Industrial Revolution. So obviously there's a huge mismatch in scale, and one of the key factors to unlock scale is liquidity. And that brings me to my next slide, which is sort of highlighting the unique benefits of spot markets, specifically liquid spot markets for these kinds of assets. So in the traditional market, if you want to buy a credit without a liquid market, you're going to call somebody on the phone, go back and forth over email, send them a wire transfer. It takes 6 weeks. Obviously, that is not going to work if we're going to scale this market up, so we need to have more rapid settlement, and liquid spot markets facilitate that. You also get increased transparency because the trades, at least in a public spot market, are public. So if you trade on SushiSwap, everyone can see what trade you executed, what price you paid, as well as which wallet purchased that asset. You also get price discovery, which is really important when you think about the different types of credit and that they might command different values. Some people might really like tree planting. Some people might really like installing solar panels. And liquid markets allow for those assets to be priced relative to each other. Now, the market is very complex. I won't spend too long on this slide, but basically there are different strata of value, as I've been saying. And right now at KlimaDAO, we've modeled 2 of those. They're sort of the 2 lowest levels price-wise. And we've got the broad-based floor of BCT, which represents mostly large-scale renewable energy projects like installing solar panels, hydroelectricity, and other technology-based avoidance. On the other hand, we have nature-based avoidance, which is what I was talking about in the Amazon, where you're going to pay people to protect some existing forest that would otherwise be cut down. But there's more here. There's mangroves, there's direct air capture, there's biochar, there's a ton of exciting methodologies, but those new methodologies have a bit of a cold start problem. In order to create a market for them, we need to have liquidity, but in order to have liquidity, we need to have supply. And so there's this cold start problem, and that's why I call the talk bootstrapping, because we need a mechanism for getting past this cold start. And the mechanism that we're planning to use, and we're in the process of executing, is to use forward funding. And the plan is basically, in the near term, we are forward funding projects basically deploying DAO capital to pay somebody to go out and plant mangroves or whatever, to launch these 3 pools. We already have projects in flight for the small-scale energy efficiency. We're distributing improved cook stoves to some refugees in Bangladesh so that they have to spend less time gathering firewood, less time cooking, and also they have less carbon emissions because the cook stoves are more efficient than a traditional 3-stone cook stove. Blue carbon, we're still trying to find a deal that actually makes sense for the DAO, but we're working on it. And afforestation, we recently announced a project as well. So I'll just highlight those quickly. We have the KIP 32, where we are funding 250K USDC for improved cook stoves, and also KIP 34, we funded 227K for reforestation in Africa. And so there's some key takeaways. These verified ecological benefit assets, impact markets, impact assets, they're going to play a critical role in mitigating a variety of social issues. In particular, carbon credits address the climate crisis. Forward funding is a necessary tool for bootstrapping these impact markets, at least if there's high capital requirements, like there are for carbon credits. And liquid spot markets are really important for giving realistic pricing, so that if you're entering into a forward agreement with a project developer, they know what their credits are supposed to be worth, and you can't hoodwink them as a financer and pay them under what the credits are actually worth because they can't tell if there's no spot market. And finally, that we're using forward agreements as a bootstrapping mechanism to get carbon credits today at a certain price, launch a liquidity pool, which will then allow other project developers to reference that liquidity pool in their negotiations of these forward agreements to bring more carbon credits supply to market and therefore have a greater impact on the climate crisis. That's it. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, feel free to get in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Marcus. Would anyone like to ask a question? We have a few minutes left. Yeah.
So you're going to be doing this for the next 10 years. I'm so proud because like all these longevity people want to live forever, but they don't think like what Earth we're going to inherit, right? What challenges do you see in terms of like expanding the scope and scaling the DAO in the next 10 years?
I'd say the biggest challenge facing the carbon market specifically right now, which is where we're operating at the moment, is that they're basically demand. The people need to want these things to happen. If there is not pressure on corporations, if there is not a desire from like individuals like you or I, organizations like the like live events like ETH Prague, who are committed to spending a little bit of their money to support these projects, it's going to be very difficult for this market to scale.
And I'm from Australia, and so my family has a property, and we got some carbon credits by keeping, acres of our land and letting the shrub grow. But a lot of people scammed it, and they stopped it. And so, who gets to?
Yeah, that's where the valuators come in, and
Gotcha.
I would say that like historically the carbon markets. Let's just say they haven't been the most avid adopters of digital technology. I mean, most of the way that these projects are verified is by like going around with tape measures and clipboards and like counting
Yeah,
stuff
some
with their
guy
eyes.
comes to your property and you have a beer with him and you say,
Exactly.
don't check the back, you're
So-
fine. Here's have a beer.
Exactly. So there's this movement
No waste
within the
of
carbon
time.
credit market to create what's called digital monitoring, reporting, and verification, DMRV. And the idea is to use, sensors, satellite data, a variety of different digital input streams, maybe with some auditing, to just spot check the projects, to dramatically increase the speed to issue the credits, and also reduce the possibility for fraud and manipulation. Definitely, it's an important issue.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I wonder, when you explained hypercerts, when we do the retrospective or retroactive funding, whatever we want to call it, does the money go to fund the original impact? So is it like a loan, or is the money then used for whatever the person or the organization that executed upon that impact? Like,
Yeah.
is it their decision?
It depends a lot on the structure of the agreement, and so there's different ways to structure this. It could be structured as a loan, where like the financier provides dollars, say, and then they expect to be paid back dollars in the future, and there might be some spread, right, where like the project developer makes a little bit of money, and the rest gets paid back to the loan provider. But actually, a lot of these forward agreements are structured as equity, sort of, where like there's risk in the project developer failing to deliver, in which case the person funding might not get their money back. And yeah, there's risk inherent to that. But what I would say is when you forward fund a project, when you buy the credits that haven't been issued yet, you are directly financing that activity, right? So like Clean DAO put about 500K of USDC to directly fund these projects. When you're buying a spot credit, an asset that's already been produced, think about like an apple. When you go in the store, you don't expect that the apple is going to like magically appear as soon as you walk in the store and reach out your hand for it, right? It's already there, and so it was produced like weeks ago and then farmed. So there's a supply chain there. But the key is when you buy the apple, you're sending a signal to the farmer, hey, there's a demand for more apples. And that's what I'm saying is the big risk. If people don't want to actually eat the apples, if they don't want to retire the carbon credits and claim I helped support this project, even if indirectly, then there won't be farmers who want to go produce apples, i.e. project developers who want to go implement, because they'll be worried that they're going to do all this hard work, spend all this money, take risk, and then no one will actually want to use their asset.
Wonderful. Buy credits, make credits.
Retire carbon, yes,
Retire
exactly.
carbon. Thank you very much,
you all.
Marcus. Give everyone a round of applause.